The fantasy playoffs are here, and in this video, we'll be talking about the 5 players who are skyrocketing up the rest of the season rankings as the playoffs approach, which means these guys are league winners. They are going to be the guys you need on your team for the fantasy playoffs. And we can start with the Chiefs running back, their RB1. And yes, it is their RB1, Isiah Pacheco, who returned on Black Friday from his injury, and we had a couple of reports come out about the usage to expect for Pacheco. The first one, and the biggest one that got a lot of people excited, was Isiah Pacheco, off of this ankle, femur, leg injury, whatever it was, is a full go, and he has no limitations for Friday. Now, I saw this and I started putting out there a little bit on social media that no limitations means that they believe he's healthy, but that doesn't mean that Andy Reid's just going to give him 20 touches. I think he's still going to be eased in to avoid maybe injuring another part of his body. Because sure, practice is one thing, getting ramped up for a couple of weeks, but going full on in a game, you don't want to tweak a hamstring, a knee strain, something like that. And for the most part, that's what we got out of Isiah Pacheco here. Like, sure, he was a full go maybe health-wise and based on practices, but they only played him 33% of the snaps. That's obviously not a full go, his normal role of at least 60 to 70% of the snaps. He saw about 47% of the rush attempts, which is about in line, half the rush attempts of what I expected. So we got a limited Isiah Pacheco in his first game. I think moving forward, it only gets improved from here. Now, in this game, Pacheco honestly looked fine. He had 7 carries for 44 yards. On his carries, for the most part, he was bottled up. He had one big run we'll touch on in a second, but he averaged 6.3 yards per touch. He added a 5 yards per reception here as well. If you look at this in general, his 6 to 6.3 yards per touch was more than Kareem Hunt had in all but one game this year. In 8 out of 9 Kareem Hunt games, he was below that metric because Hunt just isn't that efficient, at least in this stage of his career. And obviously with Pacheco returning, Hunt saw a step down in his usage. He's somebody that I believe you could probably drop in most fantasy leagues, especially with 6 teams on bye in week 14 and the fantasy playoffs coming up. You're never going to start this guy. 40% of the snaps, saw less than 50% of the rush attempts. This was his worst usage since he took over the backfield, which makes sense because now Pacheco is back. And it translated to Hunt seeing 7 carries for just 15 yards, caught 2 balls for no yards, so he totaled 9 total touches for 15 yards. It'll be better than this in future weeks if Hunt was to see 9 touches in a game, which I'm doubtful on. So I do think that at this point, you could probably go ahead and cut Kareem Hunt. Now, as I mentioned, for the most part, Isiah Pacheco was bottled up, but this run right here at the beginning of, I believe, the third quarter, the second half, for a 34-yard run, he gets pushed out of bounds there. That's exactly what they've been missing. Kareem Hunt has not had a run that large this season. I think Kareem Hunt's largest run on the year is like 17 yards, 13 yards. Outside of that, it's like 9 yards. So this is not a guy who is giving them explosive plays on the ground. That's what they need in Pacheco, and we're going to see more of that moving forward in solo your fantasy team. The matchups won't be easy. He has a matchup this week against the Chargers, a borderline top 10 defensive line when they're healthy, which they're not right now. The Browns, who rank number 2 in run defense according to PFF, a tough Steelers run defense as well in the fantasy championship. So of course these matchups aren't going to be easy, but if you're telling me that this offense is going to move the ball, which they have the past month, Mahomes and the offense have looked much better, he's going to be in the red zone and see 16 plus touches a game and passing down usage, you have to like Pacheco as a starter weekly in fantasy. He's a league winner if you had him on your bench. And another guy we got to talk about is the rookie for the Panthers. Yes, believe it or not. Now let's break this one down here. When you first look at the usage that you got in week 13 for Jonathan Brooks, you don't see much here. Like, you'll look at Chuba Hubbard and you'll say, oh, he played 79% of the snaps. That's in line with what he's been playing, 88, 90%, maybe not that high, but it's still strong. And then you look a little bit closer and you see he was seeing 93% of the carries when Brooks was out. Brooks returned in week 12, 89% of the carries. This week it dropped to 67% of the carries. Still a solid number for Chuba Hubbard, but a clear step down in terms of his usage. And that's because Jonathan Brooks' usage increased. He went from 9% of the snaps to 21% in week 13 and 11% of the carries to 33% in week 13. His usage tripled. Now, when you look in this game right here, the box scores, nobody really had a lot of success running the ball. Chuba Hubbard averaged 3.6 yards per carry. Jonathan Brooks just 3 yards per carry. There wasn't a lot going on here, but the important thing, Chuba Hubbard, for just the second time since week 1, had 0 targets in the game. 0 targets, no passing game usage, which obviously doesn't help you when you're only rushing for 43 scoreless yards. But at the exact same time, Jonathan Brooks had 3 targets. He caught all of them for 23 yards. And this is a scenario where if Hubbard would have had these extra 5 or 6 fantasy points, his fantasy day at 10 fantasy points isn't great, but it's looking better. But now that Brooks is active, this is really harming Chuba Hubbard. And if Brooks is getting this role right away, it shows that the coaches trust him. Now, in this game, Hubbard did run more routes than Jonathan Brooks, so maybe it's just this 1 week fluky thing, but Brooks was averaging nearly 5 yards per touch in this game. He just saw his usage and his carries triple in this game. That's trending in the right direction while Hubbard is trending down. If we continue to see this trend up for a very talented second-round rookie running back, first running back taken in the draft, he could break out and be a league winner down the stretch. And I mean, he has the matchup to do it. Obviously, the Eagles matchup this week is not great. That is the number 1 defense in the NFL, and they'll probably be trailing as 12-point underdogs. But then you get the Cowboys' weaker defensive line. Their pass rush has gotten healthier and better, but their run stop has not. Then you get the Cardinals' bottom 10 defensive line, and then you get the Bucs, who are just giving up points, whether it's checkdowns to running backs, receiving game usage, running backs in general. So the playoff schedule for these Panthers backs, which does include include Chuba Hubbard, but now Jonathan Brooks, who's slowly breaking out, slowly getting more usage, an extremely talented back. I think this is somebody we have to look at as a legitimate league winner entering the postseason. Hey, before we keep going in this video, I got to tell you about something I'm pretty excited about, and that's the NFL 2K Playmakers game. Now, let me explain. If you're a fan of football or just a fan of collecting sports-related stuff like me, you're probably going to love this, because this NFL 2K Playmakers game is pretty similar to fantasy football in terms of it allows you to take control of their game as a coach or a manager, but it gets better because you could build your dream team, the exact team that you want, with hundreds of player cards. I'm talking real NFL players. Now, not only will you be able to assemble your squad like a fantasy manager, but you'll also be able to make the calls during the game to actually help your team win. It's like being on the field without actually having to be on the field. Now, the NFL 2K Playmakers has tons of modes you can play. They have the seasons mode, the red zone drive mode, and my personal favorite is the game changers mode. And the reason why that's my personal favorite game mode is because it's powered by real NFL stats. And like we do on this channel all the time, we break down stats, and now that analysis can help you with this Playmakers game. And if you're actually good at these game modes, you could even win some sweet in-game rewards to boost your squads even more. So far, to me, this game is so much fun. And trust me, we love watching our fantasy lineups on Sunday. This is just another add-on, another bonus, another thing we get to monitor while the games are on Sunday. So if you want even more things to be sweating on Sundays, go to the App Store or Google Play Store now and download NFL 2K Playmakers. And here's an additional gift for you beautiful people. You can get even more rewards when you use the code PIGSKINRUN today. With this code, you'll get your shot at stars like Deebo Samuel, Lamar Jackson, Sauce Gardner, and so many more. So enter the code PIGSKINRUN in the NFL 2K Playmakers app and unlock these exclusive rewards before it's too late. So a big thanks for the NFL 2K Playmakers for sponsoring this here video. Now let's get back into it. Now let's talk about a wide receiver here, and for this we can talk about T. Higgins, who obviously to you it's like, yeah, T. Higgins has been solid this year, but do you know how good he's been? Do you know how much of a league winner this guy is? In a tough matchup against Pittsburgh this past week, he once again earns double-digit targets. He scores a touchdown late in that game, a nice toe tap in the back of the end zone, so he puts up 18 fantasy points for you. And now here's the deal. T. Higgins has been more productive when active this year and seen more volume when active than Jamar Chase. I mean, just look at the volume. He's seeing 9.7 targets per game. This includes a game where he was limited. So if you take that game out, he's seeing over 10 targets per game. He ranks top 5, not only just like on his team, obviously, but in the NFL, not only amongst wide receivers, in the NFL in target share, earning 29% of his team's targets, 27% of the red zone targets according to Player Profiler. That is well ahead of Jamar Chase right now. And it's good to see this motivation out of T. Higgins. Again, he is in a contract year. He probably won't be on the Bengals next year. He most likely hits the free agency market. The way that the team runs their organization don't really pay their players, and in general, they're going to have to pay Burrow and Chase, right? Specifically Chase in that regard. So he's probably going to be a free agent. And look at the rest of the year here. The Bengals' schedule is, or their defense is not good. And this is forcing Joe Burrow to throw more. You're looking at the pass attempts per game, 38, 50, 56, 39, 37. I mean, on average in the NFL this year, where the running games have taken back over, you're seeing teams throw like 30 to 32 times per game. Over the past week, 5 weeks, Joe Burrow is throwing nearly 45 times a game. So the volume should only continue for T. Higgins, who, did you know he's a top 5 fantasy wide receiver this year? He's number 4 in fantasy points per game. You scroll down to his efficiency metrics. He's getting the red zone usage. He ranks 23rd in yards per route run, right up there with one of his career high seasons. He is literally playing for his next contract, going to be one of the highest paid wide receivers to hit the market in multiple years at this point, and it looks really good for him. Like, you'll look ahead to his fantasy playoff schedule. This matchup this week against the Cowboys. Secondary's getting healthier, but still a solid spot on Monday Night Football. Fantasy postseason, the Titans, the Browns, the Broncos. Not the best schedule in general, but when your team is throwing 40 plus times because your defense is that bad, it's fine. You're going to still see your 10 targets. You're going to win your one-on-one matchups, and T. Higgins is the league winner. He only continues to skyrocket up the rankings, and so does Tony Pollard, because look, you're going to look at the game logs this past week for Tony Pollard, and you're not going to be encouraged. Like, just look at this game. The game script went to crap. This was the matchup against the Commanders. The Commanders score a touchdown 1, 2, 3 times in the first quarter. They get up 21-0 as the Titans fumble a kickoff. They have a fumble in general, back-to-back fumbles. Then it's 28-0 after this touchdown right here to open up the second quarter. 28-0 is a brutal stretch for a running back, especially one in Tony Pollard, who's not known as like an elite pass catching back. And what makes matters even worse was that Tajay Spears was returning from a concussion for this game. And in past weeks, like in week 10, we saw Tajay Spears see more usage because they were trailing to the Chargers. And in that game, he saw 3 receptions on 3 targets. He averaged he averaged over 6 yards per carry, nearly 7 yards per carry. He just got more usage. He played a season high 42% of the snaps in a trailing game script. So very easily in week 13, when you're down 28-0, you could have seen Spears see more work and take usage away from Pollard. But that just didn't happen. As you can see right here, Pollard plays 40 snaps to just 14 for Spears. Pollard runs 22 routes according to PFF to just 9 for Spears. This led to Spears seeing just 1 carry for 3 yards. And you might be saying, oh, but he was returning from an injury. Yeah, but it wasn't a hamstring. It wasn't an ankle injury or some sort of sprain. This was a concussion. We've seen all the data suggests as well that when players return from concussions, there's no drop off in performance. It's not a lower body injury that limits their explosiveness or ability to run or really produce. And now here's the important part for Pollard. In this game, he earned 6 targets. He caught 4 of them for 33 yards. Now he only has 9.8 fantasy points, but he got bailed out in the worst situation possible. You're down 28-0 to start the second quarter. You get bailed out by 7 fantasy points in the air in a PPR format. That's solid. That usually wasn't there in the past for him. And this usage, this passing game usage, is what really unlocks Pollard, because when the Titans are in close to maybe even they're trailing or leading in games, when they're in neutral or positive game scripts, that means they're leading. You see a lot of carries for Pollard. He earns 20 plus touches. He gets you there. But now if they're going to be trailing in some games, which they will be moving forward, you could look at their schedule. They're probably going to be trailing against the Bengals in week 15, maybe against the Colts in week 16, heck, maybe even against the Jaguars one of these week 17 on the road there. We need to know that Pollard is going to stay on the field in passing down situations. We just got that security in week 13. And if I was to pull back up that schedule here, like, the schedule is great. At home against the Jaguars this week, where they'll probably be favorites. Then they get the Bengals, who have one of the worst, if not the worst, defense over the past 3 to 4 weeks of the season. The Colts have a bottom 10 run defense, and then the Jaguars again. Like, this is a very strong spot. They shouldn't be trailing by much in most of these games. Neutral game scripts in most, maybe only down by a touchdown. They can keep running the ball then. So I do feel good about Pollard moving forward. Seeing this passing game usage, which is very sneaky, kind of have to look at the underlying stats, makes me feel even better about him, moves him up my ranks even more heading into the fantasy postseason. Now we got to talk about DJ Moore, who only continues to skyrocket up the fantasy rankings. The more and more we see this guy play with his new offensive coordinator and now new head coach, Thomas Brown, the interim head coach. This past week on Thanksgiving, massive game. He scores a touchdown in that one late. He gets 16 targets, a season high, his most with Caleb Williams this year, puts up 24 fantasy points. And now you look at it, according to Fantasy Life, over these last 3 games, and I choose 3 games because that's since he's gotten a new offensive coordinator, you're seeing a 23%, 14%, an insane 44% target share. Over this time, 27% target share leads the Bears. That ranks top 10 in the NFL during that time. We're getting the DJ Moore volume. We're getting the design plays for him as well. He's being actually used like an alpha receiver. Who knew it was that hard, Mr. Shane Waldron? And the thing that I found really encouraging was, we talked about this last week, but we saw average depth of target was just 1 yard, and then 3 yards downfield in his first 2 games with a new play caller. He was getting a lot of screen plays, a lot of short plays. There really wasn't much usage downfield, which is fine. It gets you some nice targets, yards after the catch opportunities, but it makes it hard to have explosive plays. But we finally saw in week 13 on Thanksgiving, 10.5 average depth of target. On average, his targets were about 10 to 11 yards downfield, and this led to explosive plays. You saw the touchdown, you saw the 15 plus yard gains, and you saw the nearly 100 yard performance. That's what we want to see moving forward. He has to move up the ranks. And when you consider his rest of season schedule, I mean, there's a legit chance that they're going to be underdogs most likely in all these games, trailing by a lot in all these games. The 49ers now healthy with at least Brock Purdy. The overall offense obviously isn't healthy, but Brock Purdy's now healthy. Kittle's healthier. The Vikings are going to be underdogs against, definitely the Lions, and most likely the Seahawks, even though they're at home for the last game of the year, which means you're probably going to see more of this. Caleb Williams pass attempts being 39, 47, 41, like close to 40 times per game throwing. And if you're going to get a 27% target share for DJ Moore moving forward, he's going to see 8 to 12 targets a game. He's going to be somebody who's going to win fantasy leagues. And speaking of someone who's going to win fantasy leagues, and I mean, that's literally what he's doing right now for you over the past month of the season, but people continue to disrespect Mr. Josh Jacobs. Over the past 7 weeks, Jacobs currently is averaging 20 fantasy points per game, and that puts him in rare air. He is literally right here. Saquon Barkley is number 1 during this time, the last 7 weeks. Number 2 in fantasy points per game is Josh Jacobs. So when you look over the past 2 months or so of the season, it is Josh Jacobs as the number 2 running back in fantasy, ahead of Bijan Robinson, Joe Mixon, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, all these guys. And now you look at his game logs on Player Profiler here. Let's scroll down to this stretch. Look at this right here. These are his total yards per game, 125, 108. You scroll down, he's now gone over 100 total yards in 5 straight games. But let's just scroll up a little bit more. He's now gone over at least 90 total yards in 8 straight games. And during this stretch, he has 8 touchdowns in that span of games. For a guy who couldn't score the first 3 or 4 weeks of the year, all the touchdown regression is hitting right now for a guy who has 90 or more yards in 8 straight games. And his role is as good as it gets. He's now become the identity for this Packers offense. You could see since the bye week, he's had 18 carries, 4 targets, that was 22 touches, 25 carries in a target, 26 opportunities, 19 carries on Thanksgiving, and 4 targets. The guy is averaging 22 touches per game since the bye week. This team wants to be a run-first team. Yes, Jordan Love and all these young talented receivers and Tucker Kraft, the tight end. Matt LaFleur wants to run the ball, wants to be a pound-you-out tough team, into Green Bay when it's going to get cold weather now that we're in December into January. The identity of the team is Josh Jacobs. He will be their priority on offense each week. And this week he gets to take on the Lions. He's on the road, and I know what people are going to say, oh, the Lions, their run defense is so good, their defense in general is good, this is a concerning spot for Jacobs. Sure, but do you remember that earlier this year against the Lions, in 1.5 quarters of play, Josh Jacobs had 102 total yards, then Jordan Love threw a pick six, the Lions got ahead, and the Packers had to abandon the run. But Matt LaFleur had just the plan ready to dominate Detroit on the ground, and that's what Jacobs was doing. So I'm not concerned at all about this matchup. I think he has a strong week, maybe even hits 100 plus yards again this week, and then heading into the fantasy postseason, it continues. His playoff schedule isn't the best, but it's not the worst. Like the Seahawks, I would say, are an average run defense depending on the week at this point. The Saints are a great matchup at home on Monday Night Football, the day before Christmas Eve. That could be a monster game to get you into the fantasy championship, where he'll take on the Vikings, and that is going to be definitely a tougher matchup, but a matchup in which I think that can come down to, at that point, potentially the division, potentially playoff seeding, and you're going to lean on your best piece of your offense, which is right now Josh Jacobs. Speaking of the best piece of their offense, let's go over to the Chargers, where Ladd McConkey, outside of Justin Herbert, nobody is more important to this offense than Ladd McConkey. He continued to show that, the second-round rookie this past week, where he caught 9 of 12 targets for 117 yards, went over 100 yards in the first half alone, then he didn't do much in the second half because of a couple of things. First off, he was dealing with a couple of different injuries, and Justin Herbert only threw 8 times in the second half. But there's just no target competition. I've been saying this since week 1. There's no target competition for Ladd McConkey. People saw a couple of those fluky touchdowns where defenses broke the coverage on Quentin Johnston, and they were like, oh, Johnston, he's so much better. He's going to be the wide receiver 1 or earn a lot of targets on this team. Well, that's obviously changed over the past month. He now can't catch a ball. Josh Palmer is just kind of out there. DJ Shark returned the last couple of weeks. He's not really, I would say, doing much at all on this team right now. It's really only Ladd McConkey, and there's no more proof of that than in week 13's usage, where he earns 12 targets. Nobody else on the team sees more than 2, and that's Quentin Johnston with 4. Nobody else on the team behind Quentin Johnston has more than 1 catch. McConkey 9, Johnson 2, nobody else more than 1. This is the Ladd McConkey show. Now, there is one concern. As of this recording, we don't know his status moving forward for week 14, which is going to be an important one. It is a nice matchup. It is one that people want to get into the fantasy postseason with a lot of teams on bye. He's dealing with not only a shoulder injury that we saw in that game, him looked like he was dealing with pain, but also picked up a knee injury, didn't come in for the final plays when they were kneeling it out, working through a couple things right now. We're going to have to see the reports on this, assuming it's nothing major, and the current reports don't seem major. He is getting an MRI. By the time you're watching this, that might already be out. Fingers crossed that it's all good. Assuming it's all good, this guy continues to be a league winner down the stretch. And he has a nice matchup. Like, look, he has a nice matchup rest of season. This week against the Chiefs, sure, you might be scared about that matchup, but we just saw Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers dominate that Chiefs secondary with a much worse quarterback than Justin Herbert and Aiden O'Connell last week. The Bucs are as good as it gets as a matchup. The Broncos, McConkey did fine earlier this season against. He'll be put into the slot to avoid Surtain. And we also just saw Jameis Winston throw for 500 yards, and a bunch of wide receivers got crazy against Denver's defense, so I'm not too concerned about that. And then the Patriots in the fantasy championship is just a fine matchup. Like, it's nothing scary. It's nothing worrisome. I think that Ladd McConkey continuing to see 8 to 12 targets a week with Justin Herbert being efficient, with this team throwing a lot more than they have been for the first month or two of the season. I think things are lining up well, assuming he's healthy, for McConkey to definitely rise up the rankings every single week as he has and be a league winner. Speaking of rising up the rankings, if you want to see my rest of season rankings and my weekly rankings projections, game-by-game matchup notes for every single player, you can get the Fantasy Blueprint. It's linked down below if you want this to help you get into your fantasy postseason and help you all the way up until your fantasy championship. It is risk-free this year. There'll be a QR code on the screen right now. Also, click the link in the description below to follow the simple steps and join the 21,000 other people using my tools to help them win their leagues. And now maybe the most obvious player skyrocketing up the fantasy rankings right now, because he dominated in week 13, Bucky Irving, the 4th-round rookie running back for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In week 13, or in week 12, if we go back a week against the Giants, a team that allows the most rushing yards per play, Bucky Irving made them pay with over 150 total yards, a touchdown, a 27 fantasy point day. He was the running back 3 on the week. Then he entered week 13 with an even better matchup. The Carolina Panthers, who allow the most rushing yards per game and second most rushing TDs per game. Bucky Irving somehow one-upped his performance from last week. He said, oh, I only had 150 total yards and a touchdown last week. This week, let me go for 185 total yards, another touchdown, a career-high 25 carries and 28 total touchdowns. His 30.8 fantasy points on the week was number 1 amongst all running backs. So now this rookie running back, this 4th round, not an early round pick, 4th round rookie running back, has finished as a top 3 running back in back-to-back games. And now over the past month of the season, since he's been returning from his bye week and a little bit more than that, Bucky Irving ranks 3rd in fantasy points per game behind only Saquon and Josh Jacobs, ahead of Bijan Robinson, ahead of Chase Brown, who's been breaking out, ahead of Devon Achane, who's been awesome as well. The dude is averaging 22 fantasy points per game, and he's no longer the running back 2 or the 1B on this team. He is the clear 1A, and maybe even the 1 with Rachaad White being the clear 2 at this point. Because since the week 11 bye, these last 2 games, Bucky has 46 touches and is averaging 7.3 yards per touch, while Rachaad White has 25 touches and is averaging 4.7 yards per touch. He's just way more efficient, way more dynamic, makes men miss a lot more than Rachaad White, and it's paying off in his total touches. What's also important to point out is in week 13, Sean Tucker saw 0 snaps. You can see right here, it was just Bucky Irving and Rachaad White, according to PFF, the only running backs that took a snap, 43 for Irving, 42 for White. Sean Tucker saw no snaps at all, because in week 12 against the Giants on the goal line, Sean Tucker fumbled. He has not played since that point, and if that's going to be a trend moving forward, it means only even more touches and snaps for Bucky and red zone opportunities. For a guy who arguably has the best remaining schedule this season for a running back, this week against the Raiders at home as a 7-point favorite, wouldn't be shocked if he puts up another 100 plus yards and 20 points. Then the Chargers will be his toughest matchup, but he has a passing game role, so even if they fall behind, that's okay, but that game should stay close. Then he gets the Cowboys' bottom 5 run defense, and once again the Panthers that he just put up 180 yards and an RB1 overall finish in the fantasy championship. He is a top 10 running back, not just this week, not just rest of season, every single week moving forward. He is the league winner. The number 1 league winner in all of fantasy right now is Bucky Irving. If he's on your team, congrats. You're going to have a very nice time in the fantasy playoffs. So these have been the players that are skyrocketing up the rankings as the fantasy playoffs approach. You might as well call them league winners. But if you want to see the players that you should be stashing this week that can become potential league winners, well, check out this video that dropped earlier in the week right here. These are the guys that are just one injury away from legitimately winning leagues down the stretch. Make sure they're on your roster.